This conference will now be recorded.
So yes, today's topic for our webinar is how we can support survivors of suicide loss. And we have a few different speakers who will be sharing information with us throughout our webinar. We have somebody who's going to be sharing resources through the Everytown Survivor Network. We're going to learn how we can support and learn from loss survivors and postvention efforts that are happening in Oregon. We'll also hear from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention on how they engage and support loss survivors. And then at the end, the hope is to have a group discussion on kind of like what role suicide loss survivors play in your local coalitions, if you're a part of one, or in your organizations, and if you have something specific that you've done that you want to share with the group. And we'll do that through a group activity on a Jamboard at the end, so we can all participate in that. And just really quickly, our vision for the Oregon Alliance to Prevent Suicide, if this is your first time here, is that in Oregon, all young people will have hope, feel safe asking for help, can find access to the right help at the right time to prevent suicide, and live in communities that foster healing, connection, and wellness. And before we kind of dive into it, as you kind of saw on the agenda, the topic of today is on suicide loss survivors and how we can support them and what we can learn from them moving forward in our work. And so I just really want to just remind folks and encourage you to take care of yourself during today's webinar. If you do need to talk to someone, please feel free to message Annette. She's agreed to be our support person for today, so you can message her individually through the chat on GoTo if you just need somebody to talk to. And you can also utilize these other crisis services that I have on the slide. So there's a text line, there's the Lines for Life number, and there's also a behavioral health support line that I didn't know about before today, but that's for folks who aren't necessarily in a suicidal crisis, but just really need to talk through stuff. And so those services are available. We've talked about safe messaging in the past, but I just have this up here. This is a resource from the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I just wanted to kind of have this as a reminder. I won't go into the details of it, but just so that way people can have this as a reference for moving forward, because these slides will be sent out to everybody afterwards. And Brandi is our first speaker today, and she is with Moms Demand Action, and she will be sharing with us resources that they have available through the Everytown Survivor Network. And so I will turn it over to Brandi so she can share with us before she has to head off to another time commitment that she has. So Brandi, let me know when you need me to move the slides forward.
Okay, great. You can go ahead and move it to our first slide. Yes, can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up if I'm...
We can hear you.
Okay, great. My name is Brandi Steelhammer. I live in Bend, Oregon, and I am a social worker, and I am a leader of the Central Oregon Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. I come to you today as a consumer of the Everytown Survivor Network, and I'm going to share about that today. I am a suicide loss survivor. And so I come to you as somebody who has utilized the services within Everytown. And so I want to talk to you about that. Everytown for Gun Safety is the largest gun violence prevention organization in America with over 6 million supporters. And it is often surprising for people to realize that we do work toward firearm suicide prevention. Firearm suicide is gun violence, and we know that 2/3 of yearly gun deaths in America are suicides. In Oregon particularly, 81% of our yearly gun deaths are suicide. So we are actively, as an organization, working to prevent suicide. We have an initiative called Be Smart for Kids, where we teach adults how to secure firearms safely. We also are trying to get the word out about Oregon's civil order, which is called an extreme risk protection order, where a family can petition the court or police can petition the court to have the firearms temporarily removed from somebody who is in crisis. And a lot of us here in Oregon don't realize that that's a tool that we can utilize. So we are actively working on that. As you can see on the slide, the programs under Everytown for gun safety are Moms Demand Action, which is what I am working within, but there are several other programs, and I want you to utilize the everytownresearch.org and everystat.org because there are suicide statistics, firearm suicide statistics that can be helpful as you're doing work and talking about suicide, and those are helpful resources to know about. Okay, go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm going to read to you because I can't say it better than how Everytown Survivor Network has put it into words. So I'm going to read to you what the Survivor Network is. The Everytown Survivor Network is a nationwide community of survivors working together to end gun violence. The Survivor Network amplifies the power of diverse survivor experiences to put a human face to our nation's gun violence crisis. We connect survivors to build community, offer trauma-informed programs and trainings, and provide information on and referrals to direct services. So as a consumer of the network, I have been with a survivor within the network for about 3 years. And every few months I get a newsletter that tells me all of the services that I can choose to participate in, and those services are free. They offer support groups. So this summer was the first time that I chose to be part of a peer support group. And mine was particular to suicide loss, to firearm suicide loss. And so it was an 8-week peer support group led by firearm suicide loss survivors. And we met for 8 weeks, once a week, and it was so wonderful to meet with people who had a similar experience to me and to be able to share our stories. And they also taught us some grief and loss information, trauma information, and I just felt like it was a really helpful activity to be able to do on Zoom. And I met people throughout the United States that had were survivors of suicide loss. We also offer Survivors Connect and Learn, which is they have trauma-informed webinars and trainings, and they teach people who want to tell their story to how to do that effectively. And that has been another really helpful point of contact for survivors. I also wanted to share with you that there is free access to online counseling. So everything I'm talking to you about through the Everytown Survivor Network is free. There is no obligation to participate. If you do sign up to be in the network, you just get this newsletter and it invites you to sign up for more programs and services. But it is never pushed. I've never been asked for money. And the online counseling is through BetterHelp, and that is completely free. If people want to join the Survivor Network, they can text the word survivor to 64433. And what's really important is that Everytown Survivor Network is very aware that not everyone who has been through a suicide loss calls themselves a survivor. That word is a personal choice of whether we choose to identify as a survivor. Some people choose to use that word, some people don't, and you do not have to use that word to be part of the network. If you have been personally affected by gun violence, you can be in the network and there is no pressure to use that terminology, but that is what the organization uses. There is a website called momentsthatsurvive.org. It is a place that firearm loss, gun violence survivors, including firearm suicide loss survivors, can go to and actually create a story that they want to share about their loved one who passed away. And it is a way that we can honor our loved ones and support each other within that website. So we lift each other up through that website. You can also go to that website, momentsthatsurvive.org, and you can find out more about how to join the Everytown Survivor Network if that's something that that feels right to you. So that is the information that I wanted to share with you today, and I'm happy to take your questions. Again, I'm a consumer of the Everytown Survivor Network. I'm not a planner in it or a leader, but I will do my best to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Brandi, for your time. And while folks are thinking of questions, one that comes up, you said that like things are free and that folks, like, you're never asked to make a commitment or like to donate funds. Another question and like thought, are members of the survivor groups expected to like align with the gun policy stances of the group, or would you say that there's folks of all different thoughts and beliefs that participate?
Yeah, that's a great question. Within general, within Everytown for gun safety, we have gun owners, we have people who spend a lot of time with sport hunting and such, including my family. We are a hunting family, a gun owning family. So within all of Everytown, that there is no pressure to align in a certain way. We are a varied and diverse group of people who want to see a decrease in gun violence. So that is very much respected.
Thank you. Do other folks have questions that they would like to ask Brandi while we have her here?
Is this only for gun violence? Or is it for any survivor of suicide?
Within the Everytown Survivor Network, it would be someone who has been personally affected by gun violence. So it would be a firearm suicide loss survivor. So this is particular to those lost someone by firearm suicide, which we know that here in Oregon, we have a very high percentage of our gun violence is suicide, 81% a year.
And Mary, that's a good question. When we hear from Taylor later today, she'll be also going over resources for loss survivors that have a broader scope too. So we'll be hearing about that later as well. Annette, you unmuted. Do you have a question?
I do, thanks. Brandi, one of the places in Oregon that we've really seen a gap actually is around support for loss survivors in a variety of ways. And at the same time, when I think about our coalitions around the state and the people who are doing on the ground work, an awful lot are survivors. And so it's sort of this irony that we've got leadership from folks who are survivors without really, I think, a robust support system. And I'm wondering, like, as our regional coalitions look at how to support their communities, how would you suggest they try and link people with this survivor network? And do you think this is kind of a way that survivors in Oregon could have access to free services and free supports?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I think what's the most helpful is if we have leaders within these different coalitions who are suicide loss survivors, particularly firearm suicide loss survivors, if they join the network, if they sign up as wanting to be part of the Everytown Survivor Network, they can see what it's like for themselves, which then gives the opportunity, like I'm doing today, of speaking about what my own experience has been in it, and then to be able to personally recommend it because I've done it, I've been part of it. And I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I wasn't sure what to expect within the network. And when I joined the Peer Connect support this summer, I was so impressed with how trauma informed their services are. They are top notch with It's not counseling. They're not offering counseling in this Peer Connect support groups, but you can get counseling through the online BetterHelp. But we're just really, really impressed with their work that they're doing. So to answer your question, the Everytown Survivor Network, it's robust. It is very well organized. This weekend they offered the first ever Survivor Summit. So we had 2 hours online of a webinar on Friday, and then different 5 hours on Saturday, where we were in breakout sessions, and we got to hear from legislators who were also survivors, most of them from firearm suicide loss. And so it's a robust program that I think I would love everybody to know about it and to utilize it.
Thank you, Brandi. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I just want to ask, and Joseph, if you want to speak up too after I read your questions, please feel free to, since you're the asker. But Joseph's wondering what the demographics are like in Bend where you live. Do you have many veterans? And also, have you felt supported after your loss by the communities that you're in?
We have a lot of veterans here, and we were lucky enough that Deschutes County Health came out with a really, like, a 55-page report on suicide loss. The Central Oregon Alliance to Prevent Suicide came out with a robust write-up about statistics on suicide loss here in Deschutes County, and so that was really helpful for us. And of course, older men were the biggest demographic that we needed to be concerned about, and that's for all forms of suicide, not strictly firearm. And what we found was that construction workers were the demographic we needed to really focus on here. So that is being focused on. And yes, we do have many veterans here. And as far as me feeling supported in my suicide loss, that happened when it was 18 years ago. And I would say at that time, I didn't have the structure, and I think this is common. I actually hear this in the Everytown Survivor Network still. People don't often realize they are survivors. And so what I have appreciated about the Everytown Survivor Network is it gives us some scaffolding, some structure to start being able to create the story, to live in our story, and to step into that space of saying, I am a survivor. And there are so many varied stories, and the network has made it really clear to us that we don't compare people's stories. Because for me, it was my close friend that died and not a family member. And I didn't necessarily feel that I had was I really a survivor? I wasn't in the room when it happened. It wasn't a close family member. And so the network has made it really helpful to be able to step into my own story and own my own trauma and grief around my particular story and not comparing to others. They're very, very supportive about that.
Thank you. And I have a quick question that I feel like you kind of touched on a little bit with your answer that you just provided, but would you say that folks who are like in different parts of their healing journey would you say that the supports and the resources are kind of like accessible to like everyone on their healing journey? So if they just experienced their loss versus like kind of what you were saying, like it being years or even just a short amount of time, like wherever they are, how would you say that the resources are? I don't know how to word that question, so I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense.
Okay,
when I was in the Peer Connect support group, we had people who had, one woman had lost her mother at age 2, so she didn't even really remember her mom. And she was feeling, and she's, that was many, many years ago, and she was processing that. We had someone else who had lost a child just 4 months prior. I have a feeling that what the Peer Connect support group did for her was to reach out to her separately because she was having quite a bit of difficulty emotionally And so I am almost positive that what they did was behind the scenes reach out to her and offer more one-on-one type of support, and hopefully connecting her to the online BetterHelp counseling as well. So to answer your question, yes, I believe that people will be supported no matter what length of time has happened between.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Brandi. I think that we might have time for like one more question if folks have it, and then I want to make sure that we're able to thank Brandi and she can get to her next time commitment. But is there one more question that folks may have? No? Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much, Brandi, for your time and for sharing part of your story and for sharing these resources for survivors with us. We really, really appreciate it. And I look forward to working and talking with you more soon.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you too.
So, as we transition from that, before we kind of jump into our next topic, I was hoping that we could just take like maybe 15 seconds and just try and just to process everything that we heard and just the resources that are available and for folks, and just to kind of, so if we could just have maybe like 10 seconds of like just kind of silence. You can close your eyes, see if that helps. Just take some deep breaths. I'll stop talking so we can actually have silence. Okay. Great. Thank you all so much for doing that. And I hope that that was helpful as we transition into hearing from Chris, who works with AOCMHP, which is a lot of letters to say the Association of Oregon Community Mental Health Programs. Chris is the statewide Postvention Connect lead, not leader, there's a different, or coordinator, statewide coordinator for that. And they are here to share with us how we can support and learn from lost survivors. And Chris, I believe that I gave you the power to share your screen for your slides, but let me know if it doesn't work for you.
Sure. It's been a minute since I have shared on GoTo, so.
Here, I will, I think that if I do it again, like a little pop-up will help. There you go. Sweet.
Yeah. And let me get to the top of this presentation. Sorry.
If you go to slideshow, yep.
I usually use the thing on the bottom, and then the GoTo pop-up is blocking that. It's like, I don't know where to actually start the slideshow. So, thank you, everybody, for your patience with that. There we go. My name is Folko. I use she and they pronouns. I'm the Postvention coordinator with AOCMHP, like Jen mentioned, and I'm here to talk about some history, past, present, future of postvention in Oregon, a lot of what we see throughout the state, and I'll just make quick reference up at the top that I'm not necessarily going to be getting into what community level groups are doing, and so I would encourage you throughout the presentation, if you know of things that are happening in your local community that is specific to postvention and this sort of support, please put it in the chat. One of the things that we do with postvention is really look at it as a public health sort of issue and sort of way to respond to things. And so the best way that we can really embrace that is by sharing these resources what's going on. So I'll start off with just a quick, sorry, I don't know how I got out of that. With a quick definition of postvention, which is a planned response after a suicide death occurs to help with healing and reduce risk of further suicide incidents. And so we really want this to be a planned response so that we can have direction for ourselves in times of crisis. So we can aim for any sort of consistency in how we respond to any traumatic death or any sort of sudden death within our communities, to formalize partnerships and relationships within our community to respond and to offer support, and then to also really customize it to our community. There's no one size fits all approach. It's going to be different probably in every scenario. And so having a plan that's really structured but flexible to customize to what's going on in the moment is something that's really helpful. And of course, this is a very important component of prevention as well. I don't know why the slideshow keeps exiting. Anyway, when we think about postvention response, we think of it on a couple of different levels. So the targeted level would be looking at how do we respond most immediately to family, to friends of the person who has died, to offer them supports in the moment. The targeted response is going to be highly customized. It's going to be happening, again, right away and probably for the longest amount of time. The next sort of response that we think about is an indicated response, which might be looking at the larger community. What sort of resources are we going to get mobilized to a school, for example, who've lost a student or a teacher or somebody important in that community? And what sort of brief supports are we going to make available? How do we communicate about what has happened and what to expect? And all of those other things. I'm going to leave it on this view just because I think it probably won't pop out as often. And then the universal response includes things that everybody in a community might receive after a suicide death has occurred. And so we even think about media coverage. Jen shared some things about safe messaging at the beginning. And so we think about safe messaging in talking about a suicide death as part of postvention response. We know that the way that we talk about suicide can influence behaviors or feelings of suicide, thoughts of suicide for others. So even looking at media coverage as a universal type of postvention response. All of this stuff is generally happening all at the same time. So something that I really like to call attention to is that we have a lot of folks doing postvention response in our communities. Again, it's a public health sort of thing. And so we've got tons of folks working on this, and nobody is responsible for any one single part of it. It's a community effort. So to help bolster this and to try to strengthen it, we have a lot of legislation in Oregon about postvention. And actually, for those who aren't familiar or don't know this, Oregon was the first state in the country to have any sort of legislation related to postvention. And the reason why we did this is so that we could mobilize resources to communities that experience the loss of a young person to suicide much more quickly, and to also be able to collect information on what's going on so that we can take a statewide approach in responding to suicide or preventing suicide in a faster way. We know that a lot of times data has a big lag, and so by having this legislation saying we need to let OHA know if something has happened within 7 days, it helps us to do things a lot quicker. The other piece that the initial legislation did for us is that it also mandated each county to designate a postvention response lead, and for each county to have a postvention plan. So if you know your lead, if you know your plan, that's a really good positive thing that we can do to be part of postvention in our communities. And then we've had other pieces of legislation come along to talk about different sectors, like in schools. Now schools are required to have comprehensive prevention, intervention, and postvention plans. And then these other pieces just help us to make the communication between sectors a lot easier, faster. So again, we can mobilize. And it's something that we may continue to see legislation for, to refine it and to get it right. But this is a really strong support, I think, for our communities, because it means that on a statewide level, we're talking about this and we're showing that we care about this as an issue and getting loss survivors the resources that they need. This is just a schematic of how it all works together. Again, there's a lot of stuff happening all at once in a postvention response. And so you can see here kind of how it all works together and the different levels that are happening, all the way from the communication to the response to other postvention activities. And then in the bottom left corner here, you see Activate Suicide Rapid Response. Suicide Rapid Response is a program for life, where if a community is in a postvention response and they're just tapped out, maybe they don't have resources, maybe they don't have folks trained in postvention, maybe the folks who are trained are completely overwhelmed and they just can't they can't respond to this in the way that they know best. So they can invite in suicide rapid response to their community to do things like hosting community forums and listening sessions, doing debriefings, and getting connections to other grief and bereavement support groups, or even other community groups that do work in this area, like Youth Era, the Oregon Family Support Network, and things that are local to that community as well. They can help make those connections for a period of 60 days after they've been invited into that community. And that doesn't need to happen immediately after the suicide death has occurred. It just, whenever the community feels like they need it in response to a suicide death. So another part of all of this is our local mental health authorities, or our community mental health programs in some places. They're really the hub for our countywide postvention response, thinking about how they are the ones that are designated in our legislation to have the postvention response lead, to do the reporting to OHA, to do the planning for on a countywide level. So they really are that central point for us in getting those community partners together in information sharing, in resource sharing, and collaboration, coordination, communication. A lot of these C words come up a lot in what we're doing with postvention. Another thing that we support all of this, we have the Connect Postvention training, and this is something that's really on capacity building for organizations and communities, for anybody who might be involved in responding to a suicide death or a sudden death in their community. And I really appreciate having this training, because if we have folks who know what to expect after a suicide death occurs, then we can walk people through it as they're going through it. A lot of times trauma can happen because things are happening in a way that you feel like it shouldn't be happening. But if we can be there to hold somebody's hand and say, we know this is how it has to happen in this way. We're here to be with you through it all, and this is what we can do to help you out. So the postvention training has 4 modules. The second one is broken up into 2 parts, but it really goes through raising an awareness of the impact of suicide loss through some education on grief and bereavement in individuals, in families, and communities, and then thinking through how do we move into a healing space and reducing risk on that community level. The last 2 modules are professionally specific. So the third one talks about policies and procedures that are best practice recommendations for different work sectors like schools or first responders. I say best practice recommendations because we know, again, we want to customize this to the community, and what the community needs might be in a little bit of friction with what is best practice, but we know that best practice means different things in different places. So these are recommendations. And then the last piece is on bringing back postvention into the prevention realm, reviewing some things about warning signs of forced suicide, but also as we are helpers in this, what do we need to be asking ourselves and scanning in ourselves to find out, are we okay after responding to something? Am I doing all right? Do I need to ask for help for myself? And so we get into a little bit of that as well. The training is generally just offered to known groups of professionals who might need to work together in a response. So this could be within an organization or across multiple sectors. The training is 4 to 6 hours long. Depends on what you need. We really try to customize what the community has experienced and the expertise of folks in the room. We know that there's a lot of expertise and knowledge that goes a long way. But we also know that the work of postvention continues far beyond the immediate crisis of a suicide death. Think about both maybe my own birthday and the birthday of the person who has died, holidays, maybe the anniversary of their passing, or major life events. For example, if it's a young person who has died by suicide, when they would have graduated high school, or their prom, or homecoming, or those sort of things, or even maybe if I'm getting married and the person that has died is somebody who I would have wanted to be at my wedding. Those sort of times are times that really activate our grief, and are times when I think what we learn in postvention, what we know about postvention, is appropriate to say we're still in a postvention response. There's no timeline necessarily for when this ends. And I put on the side here this definition of secondary loss, because Sometimes just having names for things that we experience help us to experience them with less judgment. Grief is something that's incredibly and personal, and I think we sometimes get into our minds and bodies about, I should be over this by now, or why am I still feeling this? And so having some words to put to it, secondary loss being other sort of things that might be happening after a major loss. So that could be things like losing some of your worldview or some expectations for the future, which is why I bring it up with the thinking of
three.
Sure. The other piece to this is that it's really never too late to reach out to a loss survivor, or if you are a loss survivor and need help or want to talk to somebody, it's never too late to reach out, share a memory, to ask for it, to offer help. We're really thinking about postvention beyond that crisis level into much longer timeframes. And so to do this, something that I'm previewing for you, and is almost to save the date. We don't have the dates yet, but working together on putting a postvention webinar series for the spring to go into these longer term issues related to postvention. So we are partnering with the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project to really share about their recovery and renewal framework. The postvention training that we have and a lot of what we do is more in the response realm of things. And now we want to talk about these long-term processes of integrating what we've experienced and holding that loss as a community, and also building into recovery and renewal. So the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project is taking the lead on this first session, which is on postvention recovery and renewal. And then they're also helping us out with the other 3 sessions. The next session would be on reaching community, which is an exploration of practicing postvention with cultural humility and how to really follow a community's lead in what they need and what they do in a postvention response, or in how they grieve or how they understand things like suicide, and also thinking about who might be left out of traditional postvention responses, because the truth is we might be missing people. So how do we think about that? How do we find the communities who are maybe grieving on their own and we might be able to do a little bit better by? Another topic that we're looking at is the intersection of postvention and disaster, and how postvention skills might be transferable to other contexts like disaster. So responding during a pandemic or with the natural disasters we've been experiencing, and just thinking about how all of this really ties together, right? When we're thinking about this long-term piece of postvention, we're thinking about a lot that is happening within our communities and within our lives. And I think it's really kind of pointing towards a little bit of a culture change as well. So that brings us to the long-term supports of what exists in our communities, what exists across the country to work towards healing, renewal, recovery, all these sort of things. And how can we take this as that call for culture change and being able to hold people in grief and loss a bit better. So that's a preview for what's coming up. And before I end, I wanted to share a couple of resources that are really great that we have for supporting people in their grief and loss. One of them being the Dougie Center, which is based in Portland, but is nationally recognized as a really great resource for grief and loss, specifically for children and families. And I pulled a screenshot from the bookstore just so you can see a variety of resources and publications that they have. Sometimes it's really helpful. You know, we have tons of websites and things that we can point people to, but having something to hold on to can be really helpful, like the After a Suicide Death activity book for grieving kids. That's a really amazing resource to be able to work on with young people, with kids after a suicide loss. And because it's that physical thing, it's also something you can return to throughout that grieving process. How have things changed since the last time I've looked at this book? How are things moving? What more do I need right now in this moment? Those sort of things. School School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project is another really phenomenal resource. I just took a screenshot of their landing page, their homepage, because their resource page is gigantic and I couldn't get a nice graphic in there for you. But I really encourage you to visit their website. They have some communities of practice specifically for educators around postvention, around grieving, around building towards recovery. And then finally, this is a document that I'll be sending out to Jen afterwards. Excuse me, which is tips for talking to children and youth after traumatic events. This really gives you some tips for what is developmentally appropriate for how to talk about things like death, like suicide, like violence and other sort of tragedies that they might be experiencing, and really respect a young person where they are in the way that they need to hear things and grieve. So I'll sort of end my piece there. I invite you to be in contact with me. I would love to hear any questions or comments that you have. We are still webinar series together, so if there is anybody here who has been doing things in those areas and wants to share about it with an audience, where our audience is mainly folks on the Alliance, I would invite you to get in contact with me too, so we can see how we might be able to incorporate the work that you're doing, because I know that so much amazing stuff is going on throughout the state.
You know, and Chris, I'll just jump in on here to put in an extra plug on that front around. I know a number of communities in Oregon have really had to deal with that intersection of disaster response and postvention. And so if some of you are in communities where you've had to deal with the fires, et cetera, sort of concurrently while you also are thinking about how do you deal with the larger crisis of COVID and all those things, we'd be interested in hearing from you and being able to talk a little bit about your experiences.
Chris, this is Kimberly, and for all of us, that was a really great presentation. And I just want to thank you for the work that you have done with the developers of the Connect model for postvention, as well as the work that you've done on the state level, and the compassion and sensitivity with which you have done everything. You are truly a gem.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I guess I'll use that as a small jumping off point too. I didn't mention it in the presentation, but we are tailoring the Connect curriculum more specifically for Oregon, since that's a national program and we're a little bit ahead of the curve with what we've done legislatively. We're working directly with the developers to create something that feels a little bit more appropriate for where we are and reflects the work that we've done here. So that'll be launching in the new year, and I'm excited to share that with folks in 2022. So
Thank you.
chat. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, I was just gonna say there's a question you just said there's, yep, chat. Joseph was wondering how effective is utilizing and coordinating with existing community support?
I'd like to hear maybe a little bit more with that question, if you're willing to come on, Mike.
Yeah, hey, absolutely. Hey, Chris, thank you for your presentation. I'm really a strong proponent of using existing community resources to help with projects that are going on. And so you talked a little bit about how you try to collaborate and coordinate with existing community resources. So I'm wondering how that has worked or hasn't worked. Is it effective within like the scope of what you've been doing?
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a couple different directions that I can think of to take that. One is since we started the presentation with the legislation talking about having a postvention plan and wanting that plan to be using your community resources and what exists there. One of those downfalls with the current legislation is that these are unfunded mandates. So in some communities, what we've seen happening is that they'll write their plan using different community resources, but those other community organizations don't know that they're written into this plan. So that's one of the areas that there can be a little bit of a pitfall about we have these great intentions, we have this written down, but if we're not communicating, then it's not going to work. So one of the things that I like about the postvention training is that when we do offer these 2-day intensive postvention trainings for communities, and like on a countywide level or a citywide level, is that we try to get people in the room from all of those different resources locally. We talk with the folks that we're organizing with about who would you go to if you needed X, Y, or Z? Can you invite them to this training? So we have everybody in the room to share the resources. And then on that second day of the 2-day intensive, we really talk more about how do we do this coordination and communication. And you know, my group is really good at mobilizing these resources, but sometimes we need help over here. Is there anybody in the room who does that? So that's part of why I like the Connect model, is because it's really about actively getting those conversations going. And that's when we see a lot of community strengths and support start to come out. The other piece that comes to mind for me with this question is that with the Rapid Response Program, they have some contracts existing with organizations that provide support on a statewide level, but they also have the flexibility to, if they're being invited into a community and the community says, hey, we have this really great resource, we can't pay for their services right now, Rapid Response can contract with that local resource too, knowing that this is what works best for this community, let's bring them into this response. So we're really looking at it from all of those levels.
Thank you, Chris. I'm really glad to hear that. Especially because these resources do exist. It's just a matter of how to collaborate and coordinate and stuff. So thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris, for that presentation. I'm gonna, just for timing, let's transition over to Taylor from AFSP. And Chris, I did put your email in the chat for you, so if folks do have additional questions or they want to reach out and just talk more about connective postvention, Chris's email is in the chat, so you can reach out to them. And Chris is great at answering questions, so you are in very good hands when connecting with Chris.
Jen, I'll just add one other thing. For example, I see that we have Spencer Delbridge and we have Liz Schwartz on here, who both work with very specific systems. You know, Spencer's working with schools across the state. Liz is working with OYA. And one of the things that's interesting about postvention training is, as Chris mentioned, you tend to bring together a crew from a system. And so, for example, if people from OYA, from the Oregon Youth Authority, were interested in learning more about postvention, Chris could work with you around bringing a crew together there, so that you have folks who understand the dynamics and nuances of your systems and your needs. And that's true of any other folks who are here online that kind of represent a specific sector.
Thank you, Annette, for sharing that. I think that's a good reminder for folks. Thank you. Now Taylor is here with us. Taylor is the new area director for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, Oregon and Idaho chapters. And she is here to talk about life after loss and how they at AFSP engage and support loss survivors.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Jen. And I do just have one correction. I only oversee Oregon. I do not oversee the work that is happening in Idaho. So if you have met my colleague, Ryan Price, he still works with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and had overseen Oregon and Idaho, but I'm glad to just have one state to try to do this work in. It is a big undertaking, as I think you've heard a lot from the different groups who are in this space. So yeah, anyways, I will just jump in here, and I'm hoping you guys can see my slides, and I'm hoping that I can move them along. So let me just give you a little bit of background. As mentioned, my name is Taylor Chambers, and I am just the Oregon Area Director with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Our mission as an organization is to save lives and to bring hope to those affected by suicide. I think it's really important because we have the word prevention in our name, but it's important to me that I just share with you, we're not just about prevention, but postvention is a large part of what we do too. So all that to say, we are involved in a couple of different spaces. That includes research, advocacy, prevention, education, loss and healing, and then the work that we do through those things happens at the national level and then here locally. The interactive screening program, I didn't shout that out specifically because to me that falls a little bit under the prevention education side of things. But these are all kind of different areas that we're focused in as an organization. And today I'm just going to talk about loss and healing specifically. So the way that I kind of view loss and healing or support after suicide loss is in terms of short-term support and more long-term support. And I think just reflecting back to what Chris had shared with us, this is really looking more at the individual level versus the community level. So this is just people-to-people interactions and not necessarily what communities can be doing, but how we can support individuals moving through their grief journey. So there's two kind of things that I want to mention that the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention offers in terms of individualized support after loss. We as an organization, unlike when we heard from Everytown, we don't run our own survivor support groups. So we do advertise those. If you have a support group that you'd like us to share, I'm happy to put that up on our website. So we support those, we train people to run their own support groups, but as an organization, we don't personally run any of our own support groups. It's a little bit of a distinction that we don't do direct intervention or clinical services, but we do look to support survivors in other ways. The big way that we have to support survivors immediately after their loss, what we like to refer to as kind of the time after the casseroles have stopped coming in, is this program is really there for, is it's called Healing Conversations. Formerly known as the Survivor Outreach Program. This program is really meant to be peer-to-peer loss survivor support, typically within the first year after a person's lost to suicide. There's no time restrictions on it, so if you as an individual have lost a loved one to suicide and you'd like to connect with another loss survivor, you are absolutely invited to take part in our Healing Conversations program. But I mention this because most people who want to connect with this program are within the first couple of months after their loss, I would say. And this program, what we do is we train volunteers who are at minimum 2 years past their loss. And these trained volunteers, they're not clinicians, they're not trained professionals, they're just those who have gone through a loss to suicide. Unlike Everytown, it's any loss to suicide, so it's not specific to type of means, but we support loss survivors regardless of how their loved one may have died by suicide. And I also would like to say that I think this was an important conversation that came up too. While I will say a loved one lost to suicide, that includes coworkers, colleagues, friends, neighbors. How somebody's death by suicide may impact you is going to change, you know, depending on who you are, who they were to you. And all of those individuals to us are survivors. So the Healing Conversations program, while we train individuals 2 years past their loss, oftentimes the volunteers who take part in this program are years past kind of that 2-year mark. For us, we see 2 years, under 2 years as still that short term. You're in your, I don't want to say your infancy of your grief journey, but it's still in many ways that beginning part of your grief journey, thinking, you know, from there until your own death, that would be your entirety of grief journey. So that's still very new for many loss survivors. And what we found is that those who are under 2 years past their loss to suicide may just not be in a place where they can talk to other loss survivors. Their own grief and their own death, their own loss to suicide may just be very present for them. It may be hard for them to talk about. It may be difficult for them to share their own support when they themselves may be going through some really difficult times and struggling personally. So we like to engage volunteers who are past that stage, but can help support other loss survivors. And the goal with Healing Conversations, it's not to be that sustained support group, but it's really just a 1 or 2 time conversation to connect that loss survivor with additional resources. I think we've heard a lot today about how resources, while they exist, they can vary quite a bit. We may not know about all of them. And so our goal is to try to inform our volunteers about what is available for loss survivors. So when they reach out to us, they find us through a Google search, which, I've lost someone to suicide or whatever they might search and they come across this program, it's just the first step in getting them connected to more support and within their local communities too. So it's very good for me to know what Oregon's doing. As mentioned, I'm newer to the work here locally. So this has been an informative conversation for me too. The other kind of short-term support that I want to mention is International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day. You may have seen in the chat that was mentioned. It is this coming Saturday, November 20th. International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day always falls on the Saturday before Thanksgiving. And the mission for it is really to show support to our loss survivor network right before the really challenging holiday season. It falls right before Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's, Hanukkah, and all the holidays that we want to celebrate, because we know how difficult those times can be. We know that that can be a really difficult time. And if you're feeling very isolated and alone, it's a chance to connect. I put this under short-term support, but you'll see I also have it under long-term support too. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the many events that we are hosting this year. We are thrilled to offer both in-person and virtual events. So we know we don't have events in every city in state, and we also know that not everybody is in a place where they can go to in-person events right now. So that being said, take a look at these. Feel free to take a screen capture of this, write these down. And because we have representatives from Deschutes County and the Central Oregon Suicide Prevention Alliance, please take note that they are having an event with us this Saturday. We're hosting events in Coos Bay, Hood River, Portland, and Bend. If you cannot attend any of those, I do recommend the statewide virtual event. I think we hope that it will be meaningful in some way. We know that it probably won't replace the in-person event and how strong that connection is, but we really wanted to make sure we had a virtual event this year, just with everything going on in the world and where we're at with COVID. It was really important for us that we did do this. The other thing that I do want to mention for our in-person events is that we do ask that attendees have either been vaccinated against COVID-19 or can show proof of a negative COVID test within the last 48 hours. And that's just to help protect our community again for these in-person events. Because we do have a mask mandate in our state, they will all be masked events too. The other kind of things I want to mention in terms of survivor support events that we have coming up are not just our International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day this coming Saturday, but we have this coming Friday an event for our Latinx community and for those who speak Spanish as either their first language or a secondary language. But we have a Day of Hope, or the Dia de Esperanza, and that's this Friday evening taking place on Facebook Live. I guess for us that would be more Friday afternoon since it's taking place at 4 p.m. Eastern time. But last year was the first year that they did this virtual event. It was great. It was incredibly meaningful, and the first time that we've ever seen something like this happen through our organization, at least. The other thing I want to mention is that we are hosting a Survivor Day event out in Pendleton. We weren't able to do this until December 4th, so that'll be the weekend after Thanksgiving. So it'll fall between Thanksgiving and Christmas, but I think we'll still find that it'll provide meaning for our Eastern Oregon community, even if it is taking place a little bit later. So all of these events, if you go to afsp.org/Survivor Day, you can find them, learn more about them, register for them. We would love to see more people registered, so please do share these with your communities. If you follow us on any of our social media platforms, we just posted all of these graphics today, not the current two that you're seeing. We had a smaller one for the Eastern Oregon one, and Dia de Esperanza will have a separate post, but all that said, you can always find these on our social media too. So I do just want to jump into long-term support. Long-term support for me is when we look at that 2-year mark, now we start to go beyond 2 years. So what is available for loss survivors beyond that kind of infancy of their grief stage, and to continue to support, to continue to find hope and healing after loss. I will share personally, I am a suicide loss survivor. I lost my brother to suicide in 2012. And I did really, really well for 2 years because I did a really good job of masking how I was feeling and masking my grief. And it wasn't until that 2-year mark that I actually really started to grieve. So that 2-year mark, while it's a generality, it's not for everyone. For me, I wasn't in a place where I could be talking to loss survivors at the 2-year mark. And I know many who aren't. For me, it took a little bit longer. Now I'm coming up on the 10-year anniversary of the loss of my brother, and I'm in a much better place. I can talk about his loss, his death, and how it has affected me in a way that's safe, in a way that I hope can help support others, and I'm able to share my story. But that didn't come at the 2-year mark. So I just want to mention that to say, if you are a loss survivor, or if you love someone who's a loss survivor, know someone, 2 years is a guideline, but it's not the same for everyone. That being said, I do have a little quote here from International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day. It's from an attendee, and they said, "I look forward to it every year. Put aside that time for me. It helps me get through the holidays with kindred spirits." And I put that there to mention, while this is a support for short-term survival, or in the short-term grief stage, it's also there for our long-term support. This event, like I said, it's an annual event, so it's happening year after year. It is just one kind of day, or in this case, maybe a couple of different days or a couple of different events, but it only happens one time a year. That being said, it's not exclusive to new survivors or those many years past their loss. It's really open to anyone and everyone in between. The other thing that I want to mention is the Long-Term Survivors of Suicide Loss Summit. This, we have the organization as a whole, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. We put this event on once before. We have been trying to do this event now for the last 2 years, but because of COVID, we've pushed it to 2022. It's taking place in Cleveland, Ohio over the summer. I believe it's, oh gosh, I believe it's around the 4th of July, but I'm probably a little bit off on that. I will find the link for this, and I can send this to Jen after too if people are interested in learning more about it. It is open registration, taking place summer of 2022 in Cleveland, Ohio. So it's open to anyone. What they say is that typically they refer to long-term survivors for this summit as 5 years past their loss. But again, that's pretty flexible. The goal really for the long-term summit, though, long-term survivor summit, is to re-engage those who are past that infancy stage of their grief and to really figure out, okay, what else can we do for you? What else can bring you hope? What else can bring you healing? How can we learn from you? How can you learn from others? And how can we continue to find community after loss? So I wanted to mention that too to anyone because it is open. The other ways that as an organization we engage our loss survivors is really by building community. For me, after my loss to my brother, it felt very isolating. And when I talk to other loss survivors, they say the same thing, is they feel alone in that. If you have never lost a loved one to suicide, or you haven't known someone who's lost someone to suicide, it's very easy to not know someone. It's very easy to not have this conversation because it's a difficult conversation to have. People don't know what to say, what to do, how to react, and that's okay. Death is really hard, is something that I think we can all safely say, is that grieving any loss is very difficult, and suicide is still so stigmatized. So when we lose loved ones to suicide and those we care about, we often see that we don't find that community so easily. It's harder to find community after loss. So one of the biggest things that we look to do for our survivors of suicide loss is to build community. I think that's not only serves as hope, but it also serves as prevention too. If we can connect those who have lost loved ones to each other, they know that they're not alone. They know that they're not alone after loss. And that's why we advertise the support groups. Even though we don't run any of our own support groups, we still want to make sure that people are aware of the support groups in their communities that are happening, and of other resources that are happening too. So we do maintain on our website a list of resources for loss survivors. It includes everything from the immediate aftermath after a death, and asks the question, do I have to call the police? There's an answer to that question online. So it starts at that stage of after a loss, and it builds on that all the way through programs like the Long-Term Survivors of Suicide Loss Summit. So if you can think about kind of each of those stages, there's a lot of different resources there, and I highly recommend anyone interested to check out more online. AFSP.org is our website, and you can find everything I'm talking about there pretty easily. So the two ways that we look to kind of build community through our organization is through our Out of the Darkness walks and through our volunteerism. We are a grassroots organization, and though I am on the staff side of things, I'm just one staff person for the entire state. everybody else we work with is a volunteer. I was a volunteer with the organization prior to joining the staff in 2018. So I loved volunteering with them. I did find community support in that way. And I think I call it my AFSP family, and that's truly what it feels like to me. These are individuals who truly, truly, truly want to help others prevent this cause of death, but they also find hope and healing and giving back. For so many, even if they're not in a spot in their grief journey where they can talk about their lost loved one, they might be in a spot where they can help somebody else. And that's pretty cool. It's pretty cool to think that even though we've lost loved ones, we can still work towards prevention. Not every survivor is that way. And I mentioned this to say that it can also be really incredibly difficult to talk about prevention if you've lost a loved one. There's always the guilt factor. There's always the what ifs. There's always the, well, if I can prevent suicide, well, why didn't I not prevent this suicide? Or what did I do wrong? And so that's a tricky space to navigate. So we typically, when loss survivors come to us, we don't always focus on prevention. That's not necessarily the first thing we want to talk about, but that is always an option too, is for volunteers to engage in the prevention side of things. Some people find that brings them closer to the cause. It brings their heart healing, and it brings them hope, but that's not for everyone. And then our Out of the Darkness walks happen in communities across the country every fall, and on high school and college campuses across the country every spring. There's also a walk that happens overnight, so it's quite literally walking out of the darkness. This happens over the summer. There's usually one or maybe two walks that happen, that they do this overnight walk. All of these are pretty amazing communities and experiences. This year, most of our events across the country had to modify in some way, so it wasn't back to 2019 normal. I don't know if we'll ever see that again, but we did have to, move to some virtual options and things like that. If you do have the opportunity, though, to attend an Out of the Darkness walk, I would recommend it. These are fundraisers for us, as just a disclaimer and a disclosure. But for me, it's not about the money raised, although that does fund our work for the entire year. It is about the community that's there. It's so incredible to see how many others have been affected by suicide in some way. It brings together lost survivors with attempt survivors and those with lived experience. And you see people of all backgrounds hugging, and what we do is we honor our connections to the cause by wearing different colored beads. These look like Mardi Gras beads. We call them honor beads, and our colors represent our connections. And when you see a sea of people, the Portland Walk has thousands of people attend it. Some of our smaller walks, though, we still get hundreds of people to turn out. And you see a sea of people who are all connected to this cause in some way. It's pretty amazing. It's a pretty cool experience. And if you do ever have the chance to attend it, I would absolutely recommend it, as just to see what the community is all about, and to get connected to additional resources is also what we look to do through that. So I think I've talked about everything that I wanted to mention for today. I'm going to attempt to stop sharing my screen, but I'm happy to answer any questions that may have come up.
Thank you so much, Taylor, for the presentation. I think I have one question if folks, want to kind of think about, because I think we have time for like two questions. But one is, AFSP is a national organization, like you were saying, and a lot of stuff like really happens at the national level and with the local state chapters. And kind of like what we hear a lot is that folks in the communities like know their communities best. So how do you think that your national ideas and the national programs like translate to that community level? Do you feel like you're able to like work really well within local communities, like with the national ideas, and kind of like mesh them together? And how does that blend work?
That's a really great question. And I think it's not just a top-down approach, but it's also a feedback approach too. So it's not just our national organization telling us, hey, this is what we think is going to work best for your communities, but it's also the feedback of listening and us saying, this isn't really working in my community. Our national office really relies on our staff and volunteers on the ground to be the feedback loop, to provide that feedback. So one of my many jobs and the many hats I wear is to connect with our local resources to best identify if we do have, like, when it comes to things like support group and that direct intervention or direct support in some way, because we're not doing that as an organization, we wouldn't know about those at all if I wasn't in some way doing my job and trying to connect people. I would say that as an organization, it's something that, because I'm newer to my position, so I started with the Oregon chapter back in April, I haven't learned everything yet. So in some ways, it's a disservice, because if I don't know everything, I can't share everything, but I hope by attending more coalition meetings and things like this, that I can learn more about the work that we're doing. But we also really rely on our volunteer network. Our volunteers are incredible. Most of them have a direct connection to the cause. So that's either they themselves have lived experience and have had past suicidal ideation attempts, thoughts, or current. Or they're a loss survivor, and they've been connected to our cause in that way. And so for us, because these people have direct connections to the cause, they can share what's worked well for them, what hasn't worked well for them. They can share about what's going on in their communities. So we really look to get that feedback too about what's happening. And community is, for me, the community is the state of Oregon, but that it's too broad, right? So we have all of these city communities, these county communities. To me, it's also figuring out what's going on at the hyper local level, from the, not just at the state level, but what's happening in individual communities. And so, for instance, I learned more today that we do have postvention legislation in our state. So this is something that I know, okay, I need to learn more about this. It's a new thing for me, but I appreciate Chris for sharing that. So yeah, I think it's an ongoing process. It's not perfect. I wouldn't tell anybody it's perfect, maybe to a fault, but it is still, it's a work in progress. I think we get a lot of really good guidance from our national office on best practices, but we still look to our community and to get that feedback too from our volunteers about what's working, what's not working, and how we can do better. Thanks, Jen.
Yeah, thank you, Taylor. If folks do end up having more questions or want to get connected with Taylor to learn more, would you like for folks to email me, Taylor, and I can connect them with you, or how do you kind of want that?
I will drop my email in the chat now. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I did not include it in my presentation, but please do feel free to email me, or if you email Jen, Jen, you're always welcome to reach out to me with anything.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Taylor. I really appreciate your time. Oh, Alyssa, I see you raising your hand.
Yeah, I do. I just am so grateful for the Alliance for convening exactly this group of people. I had the real honor and privilege of supporting the Suicide Rapid Response with a developmental evaluation, and this fall read the feedback we received from the folks on the ground participating in the Suicide Rapid Response after youth suicide in their community. And I also conducted 2 of those interviews. Most of them were conducted by Jonathan at this phase of the process. And one of the things that we asked that folks really struggled to answer, I think in part because the interviews were conducted right after the response completed. So nowhere near that 2-year time frame, more like the 3 to 6 month time frame after the suicide had happened. But we asked them about post-traumatic growth, which is, now that you have been through this experience, what have you learned? And folks really stumbled to articulate that. The one person I interviewed who was affiliated but not directly impacted by the suicide said that actually it was an extraordinary opportunity to be so connected when it didn't hit you directly, because then you could be prepared if it were ever to happen in your community. So I just wanted to talk about what post-traumatic growth looks like from your perspective, and what ways the Survivor Summit type events and other things that you do contribute to post-traumatic growth. And as an evaluator, like what thoughts you have about how we could go about, capturing that as something we're really hoping to achieve.
Wow, those are excellent questions. I'll start just by sharing, I think, what post-traumatic growth can look like. And I think more than anything is that it's acceptance of what has happened. I think that's one of the hardest things that loss survivors struggle with, is that person is gone from your life, and there's going to be many, many, many times in life that doesn't feel real, that doesn't, that's not the answer you want. You want them to be there with you. If it's like coming up for the holidays, if it's getting married, all those big events. And I think one of the things that I see with long-term loss survivors is full acceptance, not understanding always, but just acceptance that their loved one is gone. And also, I don't think everybody struggles with this, but many of the loss survivors that I speak with do, and that's the guilt side of things. So I think in a world where we see continued post-traumatic growth is we also see being able to relieve ourselves of guilt. As individuals, none of us are individually responsible for another person's death by suicide. It can often feel that way, but we know there's many complicated overlapping factors. And for many loss survivors that I talk with, that's one of the things that they struggle with the most, is just acceptance that this person is gone and I did not cause this. And that's a really hard concept. There's a lot of things that go into feelings after loss. And I also want to mention too, it's not always sadness. Sometimes it's anger. Sometimes it's, there's sometimes relief. If you've been living with someone who struggled for a long time and that person is gone, you may feel relieved. It's also to acknowledge, to say any emotion that you're feeling after a loved one has gone is okay. That's your own individualized grief journey. That's your own individualized experience. And you can grieve in the way that you need to grieve, and whatever that looks like for you. And I also think, though, being able to talk to other loss survivors about those different emotions is a sign of growth after loss. I don't know, the second part of your question about how do we measure this, I think is the harder part. I can speak anecdotally about the things that I see in those who are, 5 years past their loss, 10 years past their loss, 15, 20 years past their loss. And oftentimes that growth looks more towards prevention, so helping others and giving back in that way. But I always see an acceptance of that person's loss, acceptance of their own grief journey, and acceptance that they are not to blame. That I think is probably the hardest thing that leaves, but that would be another kind of measurement that I would see, is where that person is emotionally and what level of guilt do they still have, what level of blame do they feel. And I think measuring that as time goes on would be very interesting to me. I think that would be a good indicator if community support is working well, is feeling that they're not at fault. Not to say that the community support is necessarily designated that way, but I think that could be one way, an interesting way to look at things. With events like the Long-Term Survivors of Suicide Loss Summit and other events that we host, part of what we also look at is complicated grief, and knowing that sometimes 10 years past your loss to suicide, you still may be grieving as if it was 2 months ago. And that's okay. That's absolutely okay. I'm going to keep saying grief journey because everybody who's lost someone has a grief journey, and that looks different for everyone. So it's kind of hard to measure, but I think that there's to me, I think that the community support is probably the biggest thing we can do to have an impact in that grief journey, is to connect people with resources, have people have conversations about this, being able to talk openly and honestly about it. But ways to measure that is an interesting challenge. And I think that there could be some unique ways to do it that I haven't necessarily thought of yet, or have, you know, that may not be possible. But it's good to know that this is a thing that has happened in some way and is continuing to happen too.
I was just curious if Chris or Bethany have things to add. It looks like Chris is just saying beautifully answered. There was so much in there, Taylor. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, I don't think that I have anything immediate to add other than that timeline does feel really challenging for asking questions related to things like post-traumatic growth. But yeah, to reiterate what Taylor was saying, it's so incredibly different person by person what that would look like. And I'm happy to continue thinking on this with you and to see what we might be able to come up with. Because right now I don't know that I can say anything better than what Taylor just provided.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that discussion and for those questions. I think that people really seem to appreciate what you were saying. There's lots of thanks in the chat, Taylor. So Alyssa, thank you for the question, and Taylor, thank you for your words. In our last few minutes together, I was hoping that we could have just a group discussion, but I'm gonna put this Jamboard link in the chat, and my hope is that you can go through and like add to this Jamboard later on. You should be able to keep access as long as you don't lose the link. So let me just go ahead and hit share and copy. Gonna go over here. And so for folks that haven't used the Jamboard before, just like a 30-second, hopefully 30-second pitch for you all, is it's just a virtual Post-it sticky note whiteboard situation. So over here on our left-hand side, we have this little like sticky note picture. And if you just click on that, you'll be able to like add an awesome thought. And then if you just hit save, it pops up. And so we'll be able to kind of like answer the questions and put our own thoughts on the board. And like I said, as long as you keep this link, hopefully you can like maybe add ideas to it as you come back to it, like think of something else that you want to put on there. But I was hoping that we might be able to have just a short group discussion about a few different questions. So like one is, what role do suicide loss survivors play in your local coalitions? Do you have something specific that you've done with loss survivors that you want to share with the group? And then also, what ideas have you gained today to help implement in your coalitions? So if folks there's a handful of you like in the Jamboard, so go ahead and like feel free to add your stickies to the board whenever and however you'd like to. And for folks who kind of like just want to voice their stuff, let me know and I can add the sticky for you if that's helpful. But I think that I want to be a rebel and start with our third slide instead of the first one. So have you all gained any ideas today that you hope to implement in your coalitions or in your organizations or just like in your specific community spheres about how to work with loss survivors and just some of the things that we've heard from our speakers today? Have you all have any thoughts of how you want to implement that in your coalitions? And you can feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. I didn't know that you could put images in here. So I think that was you, Taylor. Was that you that did that? I had no idea that you could do images. Really helpful to know that. So for those who maybe aren't on the Jamboard themselves, bye Taylor, thank you so much. Folks have put down for what role loss survivors play is to advocate in legislation to change laws around suicide prevention, ongoing reality check, and a reminder of why we do this work. So kind of just that touch point with our communities to make that change. And someone said that they're the most important leaders that they have in their groups. for the second question, something specific that you've done with loss survivors that you want to share. So Taylor put the International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day events. This is the statewide virtual one. Somebody also said the Signs of Hope campaign was meaningful for survivors in our coalition. So that was a day in September, on September 9th, that folks around the state held the Don't Give Up signs at different places in their communities. And ideas that folks have got from today are resources to share, and also people want to attend Out of the Darkness walks. And the last one that I'll read is what role folks play, the suicide loss survivors play in your local coalitions is to provide support to community leaders who experience secondhand trauma. That's a good one. I like that. Great. So like I said, just like feel free to keep this link handy. You can go to and add to it later on, or you can even just like go to it later and save it. I'll wait to send this out with the presentation for a little bit, just that way if people want to add things, they can, but this will be sent out later on. But again, like if you can always feel free to come back, it won't be deleted. And just to be mindful of your time, first I want to thank you all for being here today. Thank you so much for being part of this webinar, for listening, and for our speakers for sharing your wisdom and for the questions that were asked. Just thank you so much for your time today. I really hope that you were able to get something. And to kind of close us out of this, I was hoping to do just a group grounding exercise, because again, just we talked about some hard things today, good things, but hard things. And so I was just hoping we could do this quick grounding exercise together. So this is my favorite one that I've learned so far. And so if we could just take go ahead, take 2 deep breaths and then look around and count 5 things that you can see. So something that I could see, for example, is my bird who's getting very excited, some books, food, and then try and like just touch 4 different things and like really like feel the texture. So to get that like really grounding to bring you back into the moment. So 4 things that you can touch immediately. So like your shirt maybe, the desk that you're sitting at, your computer. And then pay attention to things that you can hear. So what are 3 things that you can hear going on right now? So for me, I can hear the rain is coming down pretty hard outside. The wind is blowing. My bird being very excited. And then let's move to our sense of smell. So what are 2 things that you can smell? So maybe your coffee that you had or some tea. Maybe some cereal. Smell is always the hardest one for me. Flowers. And then lastly, what's one thing that you can taste? So maybe you just took a bite of an orange and you can really feel that taste on your tongue. Maybe you just took a sip of coffee, life-giving coffee. And with that, I hope that that all brought you back to the moment for our grounding. Again, I want to thank you all so much for attending today. Annette and I are available if y'all have any questions, comments, concerns, or to get connected. And I hope that you all have a great rest of your Monday and a great rest of your week. Thank you all so much.